Tonight, as the soft night air surrounds you, let us gently drift back in time to a world where the tides of history were shaped by the Vikings. The sounds of the sea, the wind in the sails, the creaking of wooden ships, and the whispers of ancient rituals will be our guides on this tranquil journey. Take a deep breath. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow the calm rhythm of this story to help you let go of the day. Slowly feel your body relax, each muscle unwinding as we step quietly into the past. Tonight, we explore the forgotten shadows of Viking society. A society that, to many, remains filled with mysteries and revelations, one that held power through strength, but also through intimate and shocking rituals. These stories are told softly, for your comfort, as we settle into the warmth of this historical lullaby dot. As we drift along this journey, we will softly touch upon some of the most startling practices of Viking warriors, their intimate rituals, social customs, and how they shaped the world around them. Though the practices we discuss are unsettling, we speak of them in a calm, measured tone, as they are a distant echo of a time long past. Let's walk together through these quiet corridors of Viking history, where power and intimacy often met, shaping a world that is far removed from our own. And now, let us quietly step into the time of the Vikings, their customs, and the rituals that shaped their lives and legacies. The year was 922 AD, a distant time, buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten histories. It was an age when the world was still young and uncertain, and the pathways between cultures were as unexplored as the silent depths of the oceans. Across the shimmering horizon, under a sky muted with mist, a lone figure emerged from the haze. He was not a warrior, nor a conqueror, but a man of letters, a diplomat named Amved ibn Fadlan. A man far from home, his journey had taken him to lands that could scarcely be imagined, let alone understood. Ibn Fadlan had been sent to the far northern reaches of the world, to the land of the Vikings, where the forests were dense, and the winds howled like forgotten spirits. It was a world where life and death existed in stark opposition, yet were tied together in the most intimate ways. The Vikings, fierce and proud, were masters of both, wielding their power as easily as the blades they carried. But Ibn Fadlan, in his quiet observation, discovered something far beyond what any traveler could anticipate. What he recorded in his journals, what he witnessed in the dim light of Viking halls, was a side of human nature both shocking and strangely captivating. In the flickering shadows of these distant lands, Ibn Fadlan's eyes saw rituals that would leave even the most seasoned of travelers at a loss for words. He watched as Vikings engaged in intimate rites, where power, control, and violence were woven together with the same ease as the sails of their mighty ships. These were not just simple acts of daily life. They were rituals charged with purpose, steeped in the heavy weight of centuries-old traditions. The Vikings, in their raw strength, had created a society where sexual power, physical dominance, and the afterlife all intertwined. Each was a thread in the tapestry of their lives, carefully pulled and twisted by the hands of time and tradition. As Ibn Fadlan stood in the silence of Viking halls, he noted their strange practices, rituals that involved human sacrifice, intimate rites, and sacred offerings to the gods. These were not mere customs, but deeply ingrained parts of their worldview, as essential to their identity as the ships they sailed across the waves. The Vikings, it seemed, were a people who believed that the power of the gods could only be accessed through these rituals. Power was not something one simply had. It had to be earned, demonstrated, and above all, respected. And in their world, there was no greater demonstration of power than in how one controlled their sexuality, how one wielded their physical form. To dominate and rule, Ibn Fadlan's writings were filled with subtle yet unmistakable awe. His words captured the strange ceremonies he witnessed, where life and death danced in an eternal embrace. In these rituals, sex was not a private matter. It was a public affair, witnessed by many, dissected and analyzed. The Vikings did not shy away from the intimate, the sacred, or the violent. To them, these practices were as natural as the changing of the seasons, as necessary as the harvest or the stone god. It was a world where power was not something abstract. It was something physical, something that could be seen, touched, and felt in the very air. In the quiet of the Viking hall, even Fodlan could almost taste the tension between life and death, between the gods and the men who served them. He wrote of the quiet murmurs that filled the hall as rituals unfolded, rituals of power, of sacrifice, of sexuality. Each act was infused with meaning, each gesture laden with the weight of centuries of tradition. The air was thick with anticipation, with the sense that something greater was always just beyond reach, something ancient, something eternal. The darkness that enveloped these Viking rites was not a silence born of fear, but of reverence. Each ritual, each sacrifice, was a step into the unknown, a journey deeper into a world where the gods themselves seemed to walk beside the people. Ibn Fadlan, in his quiet reflection, could not help but marvel at the way these practices held such deep meaning for the Vikings. Their world was built upon the belief that power could be wielded in the most intimate ways, and that sexuality was the greatest tool of all. In their eyes, the ability to control one's sexual power was synonymous with the ability to control one's destiny. And so, as Ibn Fadlan watched from the shadows, he began to understand the world of the Vikings in ways no historian could ever articulate. He saw, as if for the first time, how sexuality and power had always been intertwined. For the Vikings, sex was not merely an act of pleasure. It was an act of creation, of destruction, and of ultimate control. In their world, sexuality was not something to be hidden away in private. It was to be displayed, to be witnessed, to be revered. Now, let us gently pause and reflect on the quiet weight of these observations. As Ibn Fadlan's journey unfolded, as his pen captured the strange, distant world of the Vikings, we are reminded of the ways in which history is often written in whispers, quiet, lingering, like the distant call of a ship cutting through the gale. Morning mist. These rituals, though distant and foreign to us now, speak to something ancient within us all. They remind us of the ways in which power is always at play, woven into the very fabric of our lives, and how the most intimate parts of our being are often the places where that power is most keenly felt. Let us take a moment, then, to reflect upon the world we have just glimpsed. A world where power, dominance, and sexuality were not only linked, but celebrated. A world where the very essence of life itself was shaped by the rituals of the body, the mind, and the spirit. In this quiet, long-forgotten corner of history, we find the Vikings a people whose understanding of power was as raw and unyielding as the stormy seas they sailed. As we move forward, we will uncover the many layers of their complex society, slowly and gently, like the soft unfolding of an ancient story. As we drift slowly onward, we find ourselves standing at the edge of Viking society, where the seas stretched endlessly before them, and the winds whispered secrets only the bravest of men dared to chase. The Vikings were not simply warriors of steel and fire. They were also men of rituals, deeply bound by customs that touched on every part of their existence. Life, death, and everything in between in this quiet world, where the call of the ocean seemed to guide every action. Sexuality was not viewed in the same light as we might see it today. No, for the Vikings, sexuality was far more than a simple act of intimacy. It was a tool, a means of wielding power both over others and themselves. To them, the act of sexual dominance was woven into the fabric of who they were, a means to control not just bodies, but fates. Imagine, if you will, the soft murmur of the sea in the distance, a rhythmic sound that echoed like a heartbeat beneath. The quiet of Viking halls. The Vikings, as they gathered around the warmth of their fires, believed that every action was connected to the gods, and that every choice they made, every ritual they performed, had meaning far beyond the immediate. For them, sexuality became a way of marking their place in the world, a sacred rite that mirrored their relationship with the divine. You can almost hear the soft rustle of their cloaks, the quiet murmur of voices that spoke in hushed tones as they discussed the importance of these rituals. The Vikings had a deep connection to their gods, and in this connection, sexuality played a role much greater than mere pleasure. It was a way to communicate with the divine, a ritual that bridged the earthly and the spiritual. It was said that to control one's sexual power was to control one's destiny, and in their world, destiny was everything. In Viking society, the act of sex was seen as an expression of strength. It was not about tenderness, but about dominance, the ability to assert one's will over the world and others. Sexuality was, in essence, a reflection of a man's power. To be seen as sexually powerful was to be seen as a man of strength, capable of leading, capable of conquering. The very act of domination, the claim over another's body, mirrored the physical battles they fought on the shores of distant lands. And yet, there was also a gentleness to their power, a quiet understanding that this control was not to be taken lightly. It was an art, an intricate dance between two forces, life and death, pleasure and pain, victory and defeat. For the Vikings, sexuality was a delicate balance, one that required both great strength and deep understanding. It was an act that, when performed correctly, could elevate a man to the status of a leader, a godlike figure among his people. As we breathe deeply, we move through the Viking world, where every ritual, every act of power, was accompanied by a quiet reverence. Their warriors, as fierce as the winds that whipped across their shores, understood that power came not only from the strength of their muscles or the sharpness of their weapons, but from their ability to control every aspect of their being, including their sexuality. This control, this mastery over self, was the key to their success and their place in the world. Imagine the faint flicker of candlelight dancing across the stone walls of a Viking hall, the air heavy with the scent of wood and fire, the sounds of quiet voices murmuring in the background. Here, in this warm, dimly lit space, the Vikings sat, reflecting on the power that they held, not just over the world, but over their very lives. And in this quiet contemplation, they recognized that the mastery of their sexual power was not just a matter of physical strength, but of spiritual significance. To control oneself in such a way was to embody the gods themselves, to live as they were meant to live. Free, powerful, and unyielding. In Viking culture, sexuality was not just a private matter. It was a public act, one that defined a man's role in society. To be sexually dominant was to assert one's place as a leader, as a warrior, and as a godlike figure. But to fail in this realm was to risk dishonor, to risk being cast out from the very fabric of Viking society. It was a delicate, unspoken understanding that hung in the air, like the cool, crisp breeze of an autumn night, a reminder that in the Viking world, power was as much about control as it was about strength. And so, as we drift deeper into this world, we see how sexual practices became more than just a personal choice. They became a tool of war, a means of asserting control over the enemy and over one's own fate. Each act of dominance, each display of power, was a quiet yet potent reminder that in the Viking world, there was no room for weakness. And in this world, the stakes were always high, the risks always present, but the rewards, oh, the rewards were worth the cost. As the seasons changed, and the soft winds carried the whispers of the earth, Viking society remained a quiet world of power, honor, and ritual. Life moved with a steady rhythm, measured by the cycles of nature. the ebb and flow of the tides, and the quiet hum of everyday life. Yet in this world, certain moments stood apart, moments that held great significance, not only for the individuals involved, but for the entire community. One such moment was the Viking wedding, a ceremony that was both sacred and public, intimate, and shared. In Viking culture, marriage was not a private affair to be held in the quiet corners of a home. No, weddings were grand events, open to all, where families gathered, the community assembled, and every participant stood witness to the binding of two lives. It was here, in this public setting, that the Viking understanding of power and sexuality was fully revealed. A marriage was more than a union. It was a public declaration of strength, of duty, and of one's place within the social fabric. To marry was to assert one's power, to demonstrate one's capability to uphold Viking customs and traditions. Imagine, if you will, the soft crackle of the fire, the faint murmur of voices as families and friends gathered in the warmth of a Viking hall. A smell of roasting meats and the earthy scent of wood mixed in the air, creating a heady atmosphere of anticipation. The flicker of candles cast long shadows on the stone walls, and the low hum of conversation filled the space. All eyes turned to the couple as they stood at the heart of the hall, ready to exchange vows not just with one another, but with the very gods themselves. Not in the eyes of the Vikings, marriage was a contract, not just between two individuals, but between those individuals and the divine forces that shaped their lives. It was a sacred covenant that transcended love, binding the couple to the greater power of the gods. Yet, as sacred as this act was, it was also a public performance, a display of one's ability to fulfill a role, to take on the responsibilities that came with such a union. The act of consummating the marriage was not something to be hidden away in the privacy of a bedroom, but was to be witnessed by those present, as though to prove that the union was not just a formality, but a living, breathing act of strength. Consummation, in this quiet, observant space, became the defining moment of the marriage. As the couple came together, the eyes of the community rested upon them. It was not just a private moment. It was a moment of public affirmation, where the strength of the bond was confirmed for all to see. The act of intimacy, of union, was woven into the very fabric of Viking society, seen not only as a personal expression of love, but as a demonstration of one's ability to maintain order and dominance in the world. To consummate the marriage in public was to affirm one's place within the societal hierarchy, a statement that they were capable of fulfilling the role they had taken on. But as the flickering flames of the fire cast their soft glow upon the gathering, another, darker aspect of Viking public rituals lingered in the shadows, one that blended the sacred with the grotesque, the intimate with the violent. Beyond the public celebrations of marriage, the Vikings also held brutal, chilling displays of power, sexual executions. These acts, often performed before the very eyes of the public, served as both punishment and entertainment, an unsettling reminder of the Vikings' unflinching belief in the connection between sexuality and dominance. The air, once filled with the warmth of wedding celebrations, now carried the cold weight of death, as sexual executions became a form of public spectacle. These executions, performed in front of a watching crowd, were not merely acts of violence. They were ritualistic, deeply embedded in the Viking understanding of power. In a world where strength was everything, these violent displays were used to remind the people of the fragility of life and the certainty of death. Yet they also served as a reminder of the unyielding control that one could hold over another, the power to strip away not only life, but dignity, masculinity, and strength. In these moments, we can almost hear the quiet murmurs of the crowd, the low, almost reverent hush that filled the air as the victim was prepared for their public execution. The tension hung thick, and the soft flicker of torches danced across the faces of the onlookers. For the Vikings, These executions were not merely acts of retribution. They were displays of dominance, performances that reinforced the societal order. To witness such an act was to understand that in this world, power was absolute, and it was wielded without mercy. But the connection between sexuality and power was not confined to these dark executions alone. As we sit quietly in this space, we realize that Viking society viewed sexuality as a tool, a means of asserting control over one's own fate and the fate of others. The act of sexual domination, whether in the form of marriage or execution, was a reflection of the Viking worldview, that to control one's own body was to control one's destiny. The Vikings saw sex as a means of asserting one's place in the world, a way of demonstrating strength, not just over the physical body, but over the very course of one's life. And so, in this delicate balance between love and violence, public spectacle and private ritual, the Vikings established a world where sexuality was not only a personal experience, but a social performance, a reflection of one's power, and a tool to reinforce dominance. The public wedding was both a celebration of union and a declaration of strength, while the brutal executions served as stark reminders of the consequences of weakness. In the end, sexuality for the Vikings was never just about pleasure. It was about power, control, and the careful performance of one's place in a world defined by strength. As the dim light of day slowly faded over the vast northern landscapes, a quiet sense of stillness began to take hold of the Viking settlements. The sound of the sea, the whisper of the wind, and the occasional clink of metal echoed faintly through the air, creating a rhythm that was both soothing and ancient. Yet beneath the calmness of this world, there lingered an underlying pressure, a quiet, unspoken tension woven into the very fabric of Viking society. It was a tension rooted in the concept of masculinity, and more specifically, in the fear of weakness that haunted every Viking man docked in Viking culture. Strength was not only valued, it was demanded. It was the very foundation of their existence, the key to their survival. From the moment a Viking man was old enough to hold a weapon, he was taught that power and dominance were the only paths to respect. His strength was not just physical, it was also mental, emotional, and sexual. To be strong was to be whole. To be weak was to be nothing. And it was here that the concept of the Rhaegar took shape. A Rhaegar was not merely a man who lacked physical strength. It was a label that carried with it the weight of social death. The term described those men who were sexually submissive, those who were perceived as weak, passive, or inferior. It was a term that was laced with shame, for in the Viking world, masculinity was inseparable from power, and power was inseparable from the ability to dominate. The very word Rhaegar carried with it a deep and unrelenting stigma. It was a quiet curse, whispered in the shadows, a mark that could strip a man of his place in the world. To be called a Rhaegar was to be cast aside, to be reduced to nothing. The quiet murmur of disapproval would ripple through the community, and with it would come the fear of being outcast, the fear of losing one's identity. As a Viking man dot, as we reflect on this, we can feel the weight of that fear pressing down, like the cold, heavy air that envelops the northern lands. The Vikings understood that honor was everything, honor in battle, honor in life, and most importantly, honor in one's role as a man. To fail to live up to these expectations was not simply a matter of personal disappointment. It was a matter of survival. A Viking man who was deemed weak, whose masculinity was called into question, was no longer seen as fit to lead or to fight. He was not a warrior, and in Viking society, a man who was not a warrior had little value. The fear of being labeled a Rhaegar was not only personal, it was also deeply social. The Vikings were a community built on the principle of survival, where each person's role contributed to the strength of the whole. A man who could not assert his dominance in every aspect of life, whether through strength, leadership, or sexuality was a liability to the group. This fear of weakness, of being perceived as sexually submissive, was so ingrained in their culture that it became a matter of law. Imagine the quiet murmurs of the Viking halls, where men would sit and reflect upon their place in the world, their bodies and their roles in society. A flicker of candlelight would dance across their faces as they discussed the harsh realities of their lives. To be sexually submissive, to be seen as weak in this way, was more than just a personal flaw. It was a mark that could end a man's place in Viking society. It was a fate to be avoided at all costs. In the harsh world they inhabited, there was no room for weakness, and the consequences of being perceived as weak were severe. The laws of the Vikings made it clear. Men accused of being raegers, of failing to meet the rigid expectations of masculinity, could be punished with death. Such laws, as harsh as they were, reflected the deep-rooted fear of weakness that ran through Viking culture. A man's identity was tied to his ability to perform his role, to assert his strength, and to dominate. The failure to do so was not just a matter of personal failure. It was seen as a threat to the very fabric of Viking society, in the flickering shadows of Viking homes. One can almost hear the faint rustle of the wind through the trees, the quiet moments of contemplation that filled the minds of men who understood the stakes of their world. To be weak, to fail in one's duties, was to risk the harshest consequences. The fear of being labeled a rager haunted them, a specter that loomed over every action, every decision, and every relationship. And so, in this world of rigid expectations, men were forced to conform to an ideal that was as unforgiving as the northern winds, an ideal of strength, power, and control. But as we reflect further, we come to understand the deeper implications of this fear. For in the Viking world, sexuality was not just a personal matter, it was a measure of a man's strength. To be dominant in all things, including sex, was to prove one's power, to assert control over one's body and one's destiny. It was a way of demonstrating one's worth, not just as a man, but as a Viking. And in this quiet, unyielding world, to fail in this most intimate arena was to fail in life itself. The concept of the rager, then, was not just an insult. It was a profound commentary on the nature of Viking masculinity. It reflected the unyielding pressures placed upon men to maintain their strength, to uphold their power, and to assert their dominance in every way possible. And in this world, where strength was the measure of a man's worth, the fear of weakness, of being called a rager, was an ever-present quiet force, reminding each Viking man of the high price he would pay for failure. As we sit quietly, reflecting on these ancient fears and expectations, we come to understand the depths of Viking society. It was a world where strength ruled, where power was everything, and where sexuality was a tool, both to be wielded and to be feared. And in the flickering candlelight, we can almost hear the quiet sighs of the men who walked this difficult path, who understood all too well the heavy burden of maintaining strength in a world where weakness was not tolerated. As the crisp northern winds swept over the land, the Viking world continued its silent rhythm, one of power, pride, and deeply embedded rituals. In these quiet moments, when the hum of the daily life faded away and the world seemed to hold its breath, there was an undercurrent that moved just beneath the surface. This was a world where honor was everything, and the slightest infraction could ripple through the fabric of Viking society like the soft, distant roar of thunder. And yet, despite the outward appearances of stoic strength and unwavering resolve, there was a softer, more dangerous force at play in this ancient world, a force rooted in the power of words, of insults, and the sharp sting of shame. Imagine, if you will, a still evening in a Viking hall, the fire flickering in the hearth, its warmth filling the room as shadows stretched lazily across the stone walls. The soft murmur of voices would fill the air, drifting like the scent of pine smoke, while men and women alike gathered to share their stories, their triumphs, and their grievances. But even in this quiet space, there existed the possibility for something deeper, something darker. An insult. It is here, in the flickering shadows of Viking culture, that we come to understand the importance of words. For the Vikings, words were not just tools of communication, they were weapons. And when it came to matters of masculinity, honor, and power, the Vikings were quick to use words to pierce the very essence of a man's identity. The power of a well-placed insult could have consequences far greater than mere anger or humiliation. No, in this world, the power of words, especially sexual insults, could spark something much more profound, the beginning of a blood feud. Picture the quiet stillness of the hall once more. The fire crackles softly, the scent of roasting meat mingling with the cool, earthy air. In this place of warmth and camaraderie, there was always the potential for a simple insult to spiral into something much greater, something that could lead to violence and conflict. In Viking society, to insult a man's masculinity, especially in matters of sexuality, was to challenge the very core of his being. It was not just an insult to his honor. It was a threat to his place in the world, to his very identity as a Viking man. To understand the deep, quiet impact of these insults, we must first look at how the Vikings viewed masculinity. To be masculine, in the Viking sense, was to be strong, to be capable of leading and defending one's community, and to assert dominance in every aspect of life, including sexuality. The Viking world was one in which power was paramount, and masculinity was directly linked to strength and control. Sexual insults, therefore, were not just about matters of desire or intimacy. They were about control, dominance, and the assertion of one's place within the hierarchy of Viking society. When a Viking man was insulted in this way, especially regarding his sexual abilities or his role as a man, it was not a simple slight. It was an attack on his very essence. To accuse a man of being sexually inadequate, to suggest that he was weaker or less dominant, was to strike at the heart of his identity. Such insults carried with them a weight that went beyond personal humiliation. They carried the potential for conflict, for retribution, and for the unraveling of the social order. And so, when a man was insulted in this manner, he was left with a choice: to accept the insult, to endure the shame, or to fight back. In the Viking world, to endure such an insult without retaliation was to risk disgrace. A man's honor, his very standing in the community, was directly tied to his ability to respond to such challenges. And so, the response was often swift, and it was violent. Blood feuds were born from these moments, where insults, especially sexual ones, could trigger a violent cycle of revenge and retribution. The Icelandic sagas, those ancient stories that whispered of the lives and struggles of Viking men and women, are filled with examples of how these blood feuds were sparked by the most seemingly trivial insults. In one story, a man is insulted by being called unmanly, and the slight is so deeply felt that it leads to a series of violent confrontations, each one more brutal than the last. The insult becomes a call to arms, a challenge to honor, and the battle for power becomes something not just physical, but deeply personal. The very essence of the Viking world, their strength, their honor, their identity, was bound up in these moments of conflict, and the consequences of such insults could echo for generations. Imagine now, as we drift further into the quiet Viking night, the tension that would have built up in the hall after such an insult. The quiet murmur of the crowd would grow hushed, the weight of the words hanging in the air like the stillness before a storm. And in the quiet, you could feel the power of the insult settle deep into the bones of the men who heard it. It was not just the victim of the insult who felt the sting, but those who were present, those who witnessed the challenge to honor and masculinity. They too would be drawn into the web of conflict. For in Viking society, honor was not an individual matter, it was a collective one. A man's honor was shared by his family, his friends, and his clan. This deep connection between words and action in Viking society explains why sexual insults could spiral so quickly into violence. In a world where strength was everything, where power was measured by dominance over others, an insult to one's masculinity could never be taken lightly. It demanded a response, and that response was often bloodshed. We can almost hear the sound of footsteps as a Viking man prepares to respond to such an insult. The quiet shuffle of feet across the stone floor, the slow, deliberate steps that would take him to the person who had dared to challenge his honor. And with each step, the tension would build. In the space of a single insult, lives could be shattered, alliances could be broken, and the balance of power could shift. Blood feuds, once started, would spiral, moving beyond the original insult and into something larger, something almost mythical. In these moments, the insult that had been directed at one man became a collective cause, a rallying cry for those who stood beside him. What had begun as a simple verbal assault became an all-consuming force as those involved sought to regain what was lost: honor, power, and control. The Viking world, where strength was everything, could never allow such an insult to pass without consequence. And so, a cycle of violence would begin, a cycle that could last for years, with each side seeking to prove their dominance, their strength, and their rightful place in the world. As we reflect on this, we are reminded that Viking society was not simply built on physical strength. It was also built on the quiet, subtle power of words. The insults that were spoken, the accusations that were leveled, were not just mere words. They were powerful forces, capable of shaping destinies, of altering the course of lives. The Vikings understood that words could carry weight far beyond their meaning. And in this world, those words often led to consequences that no one could have foreseen. And so, as we sit in the quiet of Viking halls, the fire flickering softly, we understand that even in a world as harsh and unforgiving as this, there were rules, unwritten yet deeply felt, that governed every aspect of life. Words in this world were weapons, and the consequences of using them were as severe as any. Battle fought on the shores of distant lands. As the gentle rhythm of time passed, and the Viking world continued its quiet dance between strength and survival, we now find ourselves in the delicate realm of Viking women, figures who, though often overshadowed by the fierce warriors and sea raiders of their culture, held a quiet but undeniably powerful position. These women, their roles often seen as secondary in the eyes of history, possessed an intimate understanding of power, particularly the power to shape the very social fabric of their world through words, actions, and their control over sexuality. Imagine, if you will, a Viking hall at dusk, where the flickering light of the hearth dances across the faces of men and women. The air is thick with the scent of firewood and the faint aroma of roasting meats. But beneath the warmth and comfort of this communal gathering lies a deep, almost imperceptible tension. For the Vikings, the word was powerful, and a woman's ability to wield that word could have repercussions far beyond the quiet murmur of the hall. In Viking society, women held a peculiar form of power. They were expected to maintain the household, care for children, and manage the affairs of daily life. But they were also active participants in the world of honor and shame that defined the Viking identity. A woman's reputation was intricately linked to that of her husband. And in a world where strength was synonymous with honor, the reputation of a man, his very identity, could be shaped by the words of his wife. This was a world where a single insult, spoken by a woman, could destroy a man's standing, rip apart his honor, and leave him exposed to the harsh judgment of Viking society. The power of sexual insults in Viking culture cannot be overstated. In a society so deeply rooted in the idea of masculine strength, where every Viking man was expected to prove his dominance and control over both his enemies and his personal life, the slightest insinuation that a man was lacking in sexual prowess was enough to challenge his entire sense of self. For Viking women, wielding the power of insult was not just a matter of personal expression. It was a tool that could be used to manipulate, to control, and, at times, to destroy. Picture a Viking woman in the midst of a quiet conversation. Her voice soft but firm, carrying the weight of generations. With a single word, she could cast aside the reputation of a man. To insult her husband's masculinity, to question his sexual ability, was to take away the very essence of his identity. It was a verbal weapon, sharp and unforgiving, wielded with precision and purpose. These insults were not just casual jabs or fleeting moments of frustration. They were carefully chosen, laden with the weight of Viking values and the deep-seated understanding that power could be won or lost in the span of a single sentence. To call a man weak in his sexual abilities was to challenge his worth as a warrior, as a husband, and as a Viking. It was a public statement, one that carried immense consequences not only for the man himself, but for those around him got in the quiet, intimate moments of the Viking world, where the soft murmur of voices filled the spaces between the flickering lights. Women understood the power of words. They knew that in a society built on the delicate balance of honor and power, a woman's spoken words could shake the very foundations of that world. And so, these women, often viewed as subordinates in the eyes of the world, held a quiet, unsettling power. They could build up their husbands, affirming their worth and honor in the eyes of the community, or they could tear them down with a single, well-placed insult. The Icelandic sagas, those ancient stories that whisper through time, are filled with such instances where women used their words to shape the fates of the men around them. In one tale, a woman publicly humiliates her husband for his sexual inadequacy, using her words to strip him of his power and shame him before their family and community. In another story, a woman's accusation of her husband's sexual failure leads to a brutal confrontation, one that sets off a chain of events that will ultimately result in bloodshed. These stories are not just relics of the past. They are windows into the deep complexities of Viking society, where sexuality, honor, and power were intertwined in ways that we can barely begin to understand. In a world where physical strength was revered, where a man's worth was measured by his ability to conquer and dominate, a woman's ability to shape her husband's reputation was a powerful force. It was a force that, when used correctly, could elevate a man to greatness. But when wielded with malice or anger, it could break him, reducing him to nothing more than a shadow of his former self. As we drift deeper into the quiet world of Viking society, we begin to understand just how fragile the concept of honor was. It was a delicate, fragile thing, easily destroyed by the sting of an insult or the sharp cut of a woman's words. For in the Viking world, where strength was the measure of a man's worth, even the smallest hint of sexual failure could bring about ruin. To be humiliated in such a way was to lose everything, to lose one's place in the community, one's standing, and one's honor. And for a Viking man, honor was everything. Now, as we sit quietly in this space, we can almost hear the soft rustle of cloaks and the hushed whispers of the crowd as they gather to witness the public shame of a man who has failed in his duty to his wife. The tension in the air is palpable, the weight of his disgrace settling over him like a heavy cloak. And yet, despite the public nature of his humiliation, there is no escape from the consequences. The words have been spoken, and the damage has been done. His reputation, his masculinity, and his identity are forever altered by the power of his wife's insult. In Viking society, where words could carry such weight, a woman's sexual power was something to be reckoned with. It was not something to be dismissed or ignored. These women, despite their subordinate social position, wielded a quiet but undeniable force. They knew the power of their words, and they understood how their ability to control the sexual reputation of their husbands could change the very course of their lives. But this power, like all power in the Viking world, was not without its risks. To use such power came with consequences, both for the woman and for the man she sought to dominate. The relationship between a Viking husband and wife, though often one of mutual respect, was also one of constant tension, where power was both a source of strength and a potential source of destruction. In these quiet moments of reflection, we see how Viking society was built upon the delicate balance of power. Power that was not only physical, but verbal, emotional, and sexual. The Viking world, so often remembered for its fierce warriors and brutal raids, was also a world of quiet battles, where the power of words and reputation could shape the destinies of those who lived within it. The ability to control one's sexual reputation, to assert dominance in this most intimate of realms, was a powerful force, one that carried with it the potential for both greatness and ruin. In the quiet expanse of Viking society, beneath the echoes of battle cries and the steady rhythm of the oar, there lingered another force, one far more insidious and darker than the clash of swords. It was a force that spoke not in the violence of war, but in the violence of control, of dominance over another's very being. Sexual violence, though rarely spoken of in the broad daylight of Viking society, served as a tool, quietly wielded by those in power, to maintain their unyielding control over others. As we sit in the soft shadows of time, we can almost hear the distant hum of Viking life, a life where strength was measured not only by the ability to swing an axe or command a ship, but by one's ability to dominate, to control, and to assert authority over the most intimate aspects of life. In a society where power was absolute and the weak had little place, sexual violence became an unspoken, yet highly effective, means of asserting dominance. Imagine the quiet, distant horizon, where the Viking ships would sail across cold, storm-swept seas. Beneath the waves, unseen by the travelers on the surface, there existed currents more subtle, but no less powerful. These undercurrents flowed through the relationships, the customs, and the very fabric of Viking society. In this world, those in positions of power understood that control over the body, especially the sexual body, was not only a reflection of authority, but a tool that could shape destinies, erase resistance, and assert dominance in the most profound of ways. The use of sexual violence as a tool of control was not an isolated practice. It was not the result of rogue individuals acting outside the established norms of society. No, in Viking culture, where honor was everything, the ability to wield power through the sexual subjugation of another was seen as a legitimate, though horrifying, means of asserting strength. For those who wielded such power, the act was not simply about personal gratification. It was about maintaining a place within the hierarchy, reminding others of their place in the grand, unyielding order of things. And so, as we sit quietly in this space, we begin to understand how sexual violence became part of the very structure of Viking society. It was not merely an individual's act of aggression, but a carefully constructed means of ensuring that power remained concentrated in the hands of the few. It was a means of keeping the hierarchy intact, where the strong dominated the weak, where masculinity was reinforced not just by physical strength, but by the ability to control the sexual autonomy of others. Imagine, as we slip deeper into the shadows of the Viking world, the quiet flicker of the firelight casting long, soft shadows against the stone walls of a Viking hall. A murmur of voices rises and falls, like the steady ebb and flow of the sea. Here, in this quiet, intimate space, we understand that Viking masculinity was not just about the outward strength to win battles or command the seas. It was about a deeper, more dangerous strength the strength to control, to dominate, and to possess. In the Viking world, the act of sexual violence was a reflection of power. A man who could subjugate another through violence was seen as strong, as worthy of respect, as a leader. The body of the victim, particularly the female body, became the battleground upon which power was displayed, upon which the dominance of one individual over another was asserted. To strip someone of their sexual autonomy, to reduce them to an object of control, was to demonstrate authority in its most raw form. But sexual violence did not just affect the immediate victim. No, in the Viking world, where the bonds of family and community were so tightly woven, the consequences of such violence rippled outward. When a man committed an act of sexual violence, he did not just humiliate his victim. He humiliated the victim's family, their community, and their very sense of self. It was an act that spoke to the heart of Viking society's values. Values that were built on honor, strength, and dominance. And in this world, to be humiliated was to lose one's place, to be cast aside as weak and unworthy. The power of sexual violence was such that it could transfer not just the physical autonomy of one person, but their very dignity. When a man humiliated another through sexual violence, he was asserting his control not only over the victim's body, but over their entire identity. The victim, in turn, was left to live with the scars, both physical and psychological, that would forever mark them as weak, as powerless, as subjugated. To lose one's dignity in this way was to lose everything. As we drift further into this space, let us reflect on the complexity of Viking society. It was a world built on strength and honor, where the struggle for power was constant and unyielding. In this world, sexual violence was not an anomaly, but a tool used to maintain the rigid societal structure, to ensure that power remained in the hands of the strong and the dominant. For the Vikings, power was everything, and the body, whether it was the body of a man or a woman, was the ultimate battleground upon which power was asserted. But let us not think that this practice was a mere tool of the Viking elites, or that it was reserved solely for the powerful. No, sexual violence was a tool that could be used by anyone within the society. Even slaves, those who were the most powerless in the Viking world, had little recourse against such violence. Women, in particular, were seen as property, objects, to be controlled, possessed, and, when necessary, dominated. To be a woman in Viking society was to live with the constant threat of subjugation, to know that your body was not fully your own. It was a harsh, cruel reality, one that permeated the very fabric of Viking culture. In the world of the Vikings, the female body was both revered and violated. Women, though often seen as symbols of fertility and power, were also the objects of domination. Their sexuality was a currency used to cement alliances, to strengthen bonds, and to assert dominance. Women who were captured in raids or taken as slaves often found their bodies used as instruments of control, both by the men who claimed ownership over them and by the society that condoned such practices. It is here, in this dark space, that we begin to understand the depth of the control that sexual violence held in Viking society. It was not just about one man asserting his dominance over another. It was about the very foundation of the social order. In a society where strength was the measure of one's worth, sexual violence became another way of measuring that strength, of proving that one could control, dominate, and subjugate. And in this quiet, brutal world, those who were able to wield this power were the ones who held the most sway. As we sit in the silence of this reflection, we are reminded that the Viking world was not just a world of battle and conquest. It was a world of complex and often disturbing dynamics, where power was asserted not just through the clash of swords, but through the control of the most intimate aspects of human life. Sexual violence, though rarely spoken of, was a central part of this power struggle, and its legacy continues to echo through the centuries. a reminder of the ways in which power can be wielded in the most profound and unsettling ways. As we continue our slow journey through the quiet corridors of Viking society, we find ourselves standing on the edge of one of its darkest and most unsettling practices. In this world of warriors, where strength was held as the ultimate measure of worth, there existed a tactic so profound in its brutality that it would haunt not only those who were its victims, but also the very fabric of Viking culture itself. This was the use of sexual assault as a form of psychological warfare, a method so insidious that it carried not only the immediate physical effects of violence, but also the long-lasting scars that would mark the soul. To understand this practice, we must first understand the nature of Viking warfare. The Viking raids, which have become legendary for their ferocity and their ruthless efficiency, were not simply about conquering lands or gaining riches. No, for the Vikings, war was a total experience, a way of life that defined who they were, what they stood for, and how they understood their place in the world. For the Viking warrior, there was no separation between the physical act of battle and the psychological game of dominance. Victory was not only about winning the fight, it was about asserting control over everything, from the bodies of the enemies to their minds and souls. God, imagine the quiet stillness before a battle, the low hum of anticipation that would fill the air as warriors prepared to sail across the seas to distant shores. The men would gather around the campfires, sharpening their weapons, checking their armor, and mentally preparing themselves for what lay ahead. But in the Viking mind, war was not just a physical contest. It was also a psychological one, where victory was won not only by strength, but also by breaking the will of the enemy, rendering them helpless in the face of total domination. It was in this mental battlefield that the Vikings understood the value of psychological tactics. Tactics that could be far more damaging than a sword or axe. One of the most disturbing methods used by the Vikings in their campaigns was the use of sexual assault as a tool to break the spirit of their enemies. It was a weapon that transcended the physical realm, attacking not just the body, but the very core of a person's identity. To strip a man of his dignity, to violate him in such a profound and personal way, was to erase his ability to fight, to resist, and to stand as a man in his own right. In this brutal world, where every man's worth was measured by his strength and honor, sexual assault became a method of warfare that was devastating not just in the immediate moment, but in the long-term psychological effects it had on the victim. As we sit quietly in the shadow of this dark practice, we begin to understand its horrifying impact. The Vikings understood that to defeat an enemy, they had to destroy more than just the physical body. They had to break the very spirit of their foes. And what better way to do so than by targeting the most intimate and vulnerable aspects of Thaw, their identity, their sexuality, their masculinity, and their sense of self. To strip a man of his masculinity, to render him powerless in the face of such violation, was to reduce him to nothing. It was a psychological defeat so profound that it left no room for recovery, no chance for the victim to reclaim his dignity or strength. This use of sexual assault as a psychological weapon was not limited to men. Women, too, were targeted in this way. Captive women, those taken in raids and used as slaves, were often subjected to sexual violence as a means of breaking their spirit and asserting control. To violate a woman's body was not simply about domination. It was about sending a message to the enemy, showing them that their society, their way of life, was no longer valid. It was a cruel and deeply unsettling practice that stripped away the very essence of the victim's identity, reducing them to mere objects in the game of war. But the Vikings, in their brutal and calculated approach to warfare, knew that the psychological effects of sexual assault went far beyond the individual victim. It was not just about humiliating one person. It was about sending a message to the entire community. It was about breaking the will of the enemy, rendering them incapable of standing up, of fighting back. And in this way, sexual assault became a tool not just for physical conquest, but for psychological domination. Imagine, then, the quiet aftermath of a raid, the air thick with the smoke of the burning village and the heavy scent of death. In the darkness, after the battle had been fought and the enemies defeated, the psychological damage would begin to take hold. The victims of sexual assault would carry with them not just the scars of their physical injuries, but the much deeper wounds that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. These wounds were not visible to the naked eye. They were carried within, deep within the soul, where the violence of the assault had torn apart their very sense of self-doubt as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. The psychological impact of this form of warfare would continue to echo through the lives of those affected. The defeated would be left broken, their honor stripped away, their strength rendered useless in the face of the traumatic violence they had experienced. They would no longer stand as warriors, as proud men and women of their people. They would be shadows of their former selves, living with the constant reminder of their defeat. The Viking world, so often romanticized for its strength and heroism, was also a world where psychological warfare was waged in the most devastating of ways. Sexual assault, used as a tool of domination and control, became a means of asserting power over the enemy, reducing them to mere playthings in the hands of the victors. It was a practice that destroyed not just the bodies of those affected, but their very identities. Their very souls dot in the quiet stillness of this reflection. We can almost hear the soft echoes of those who were affected by such violence. Their voices are silent now, their bodies long since gone, but their suffering remains deep in the earth, in the memory of those who survived. And as we listen to the wind rustle through the trees, we understand that the legacy of Viking warfare was not just one of physical conquest, but one of deep psychological scars that would echo through generations. As we quietly reflect on these truths, we are reminded that the Viking world, for all its glory and honor, was also a world of darkness, where power was asserted in the most brutal and insidious ways. The use of sexual violence as a tool of psychological warfare was one of the darkest aspects of this world, and it serves as a reminder that even in the most powerful societies, there are forces that can destroy not just the body, but the soul. And so, as we sit in this quiet space, we are left to contemplate the profound impact of these practices on the lives of those who lived through them. The Vikings may have conquered lands, may have built great ships, and may have forged legacies that are remembered to this day. But they also left behind a legacy of psychological trauma, a legacy that continues to echo in the lives of those who suffered under their rule. As we quietly drift further into the shadowy depths of Viking life, we come to a practice that was as brutal as it was unsettling. A practice that not only stripped men of their lives, but also of their very identities. We have already seen how sexual violence, wielded as a tool of control, could destroy a person's body and spirit. But now, let us turn our gaze to the aftermath of battle, the moment when the dust settles and the fate of the vanquished is determined. For the Viking world, where strength and masculinity were the highest ideals, the treatment of a captured enemy was more than just an act of retribution. It was a powerful statement of dominance and authority. The Vikings, as fierce and proud as they were, understood that the most complete victory was not just a physical one. No, to fully assert their dominance, they had to break their enemy in every way possible. The body could be conquered, but the spirit, the very essence of a warrior's masculinity, had to be reduced to nothing. In this quiet, unsettling world, where honor was everything and weakness was unforgivable, the captured enemy was not just defeated, they were humiliated, their very sense of self torn apart by the hands of those who had defeated them. Imagine, if you will, the quiet aftermath of a battle, when the victorious Vikings stand above their fallen enemies. their swords and shields stained with the blood of those they have conquered. The air is thick with the smoke of burning villages, the sounds of the distant waves crashing against the shore, and the occasional call of a bird circling overhead. In this moment of quiet triumph, the true victory has only just begun. The enemy, those once proud warriors and kings, now kneel before their captors, their strength and dignity reduced to nothing. For the Vikings, the act of capturing an enemy was not enough. It was not enough to simply defeat them in battle. No, to truly dominate, they had to strip away everything that defined the captured person, his power, his honor, and his very masculinity. It was here, in this moment of utter humiliation, that the Viking victors asserted their total control. They were not just taking prisoners, they were taking souls. The process of humiliation began with the stripping away of a man's physical autonomy. The once proud warrior, the king who had ruled with strength and courage, was now reduced to nothing. The Vikings knew that to break a man was to break him completely, to reduce him to a shell of who he once was. And so, they would subject him to acts of sexual humiliation, acts that were designed not only to harm the body, but to strip away the very essence of his masculinity. Imagine the quiet tension in the air as the defeated enemy stands before his captors, his once mighty strength now rendered useless. The eyes of the Vikings are upon him, cold and unforgiving, as they prepare to assert their dominance. For the Viking warriors, these moments were not simply about punishment. They were about sending a message, one that would echo through the halls of the vanquished enemies' families and lands. The message was clear. This man, this warrior, this king, he was no longer a threat. He was no longer a man. He was nothing. The act of humiliating a captured enemy was not confined to the battle itself. No, the Vikings understood that the power of humiliation was most effective when it was witnessed by others. A public display of a man's defeat, his complete and utter loss of dignity, was a powerful tool in reinforcing the social order. To humiliate a defeated enemy was to show the world that the Vikings were not only victorious in battle, they were the masters of the world, the rulers of men. As the Vikings stood above their fallen enemies, they knew that the transfer of power was not just about physical conquest, it was about the complete subjugation of the enemy's soul. They understood that the true victory was not in the blood that had been spilled, but in the spirit that had been broken. The conquered man's identity, his strength, his sense of self, these were all taken from him, leaving only a shadow of what he had once been. In this world, where power was everything, the act of humiliating a captured enemy was a way of marking their place in the hierarchy of existence. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were gods in their own minds, and to treat their enemies with such disdain, such brutality, was to remind them that they were above all others. It was a public assertion of power, a statement that their strength could never be rivaled. Their dominance could never be questioned. But the humiliation of the captured enemy did not end with the physical. It was also psychological, a deep wound that would never heal. The man who had once been a king, a warrior, a leader, now he was nothing. He was reduced to a mere object, a symbol of the Viking triumph. And in this moment of complete and utter degradation, the Vikings knew that they had not just defeated him, they had erased him. His identity was gone, his masculinity stripped away, and his soul broken beyond repair. Now imagine, as the last of the daylight fades from the horizon, the quiet murmur of voices in the Viking hall. The fire crackles softly, and the smell of wood and smoke fills the air. The warriors gather around, their faces grim, their eyes sharp as they reflect on the events of the day. The defeated enemies are no longer men. They are shadows of what they once were, their pride shattered, their dignity lost. The victory is complete, but the cost is deep. For in the world of the Vikings, Power was not just about conquering lands or gaining riches. It was about total domination. And in this quiet space, surrounded by the echoes of victory, the Vikings understand that the true power lies not just in the body, but in the soul. And in this quiet, brutal world, the soul was what mattered most. As we sit here, quietly reflecting on these practices, we are reminded that the Vikings, for all their glory and might, were also a people who understood the power of humiliation, of stripping away the very essence of a man. It was a brutal world, a world where strength was everything, and the consequences of failure were absolute. And in this world, humiliation was the final weapon, one that could break a man's spirit and erase his very existence. As we drift deeper into the quiet spaces of Viking life, where the rhythm of everyday existence flows gently, we find ourselves turning our attention to the often overlooked figures who shaped this ancient world in subtle yet profound ways. These were the women of Viking society, figures whose roles, though sometimes veiled in silence, were no less important than the warriors who sailed the seas or the chieftains who ruled the land. In the stillness of Viking halls, where the firelight flickered softly against the stone, women sat at the heart of domestic life, managing households, weaving the fabric of daily existence, and caring for children. Yet their influence did not end with domestic duties. Viking women, as we shall see, played an active and sometimes complex role in the sexual dynamics that governed society. They were not merely passive figures in a world dominated by men. They were active participants, shaping not only their own fates, but the fates of those around them. Imagine, if you will, a Viking woman in the quiet hours of the evening, sitting by the hearth, her hands busy with the thread of a tapestry or a piece of clothing. Her face is calm, her eyes focused on the task at hand, but beneath the surface, there is a quiet power in her presence. This woman, like so many others, understood that her place in Viking society was not solely defined by the work she did within the walls of her home. She knew that her influence stretched beyond these domestic walls, that her role in Viking sexuality and power was profound, and at times, unsettling. Viking society was one that revered strength, physical strength, emotional strength, and most significantly, sexual strength. But the role of women in this hierarchy was multifaceted. It was not simply a matter of passivity, of subjugation. The women of Viking society, both free and enslaved, played significant roles in defining the sexual dynamics that governed their world. From the free women who held sway over their husbands and families, to the enslaved women whose bodies were used as instruments of control, their influence stretched far beyond what might initially be imagined. The first distinction we must make in understanding the role of women in Viking sexuality is the sharp contrast between free women and enslaved women. For while free women had a certain measure of autonomy and influence, enslaved women were bound by a different set of rules, a set of rules that stripped them of their personal agency and made their bodies the property of their captors. Imagine, as the wind softly whispers through the trees outside, the life of a free Viking woman. She is respected, her role within her family and community is clear, and her influence is felt in the decisions that shape the course of Viking life. Yet within this world of relative autonomy, there are still expectations placed upon her expectations of fertility, of motherhood, and of sexual availability. Her sexuality, though seen as a source of power, was still circumscribed by the needs of the family and the demands of the society that depended on her to carry forward the line, to bear children who would grow into the next generation of warriors, farmers, and traders. In the Viking world, where family and lineage were paramount, the role of women in producing heirs was of the utmost importance. But sexual power in Viking society was not merely about reproduction. It was also about dominance, about asserting control over one's body and one's life. Free Viking women had the ability to negotiate their sexual relationships in ways that enslaved women did not. Though their freedoms were still bound by societal norms, the women of the Viking elite, those who had power, could influence their sexual relationships and the very structure of their marriages. In these marriages, where the bond between a man and woman was often viewed as a partnership of power and social status, the woman's role was crucial. She was expected to maintain the home and the hearth, to ensure the strength of the family line through her children. Yet there was also an unspoken power that lay in her sexual relationship with her husband. To be desired, to be needed, was a form of power in itself, one that could be used to influence decisions, to ensure her place within the hierarchy of Viking society. But we must also turn our attention to the enslaved women of Viking society, those whose lives were shaped by violence and subjugation. The Viking raids, which carried the seafaring warriors across the seas, were not only about conquest and riches. They were also about capturing people slaves, mostly women, who would be taken back to the Viking settlements to be used in domestic labor, traded, or sadly, sexually exploited. These women, once captured, had no voice, no autonomy. Their bodies were no longer their own. They belonged to their captors, their sexuality exploited as part of the spoils of war. Imagine, then, the silence that surrounds these women, their lives erased by the violence that brought them into the Viking world. Their bodies, once free, were now commodities, objects used for reproduction, for labor, and in some cases, for sexual exploitation. In the Viking world, an enslaved woman had no control over her body. She was forced to submit to the will of Vevel. Her captors, her sexual power, a currency that was traded as part of her value. The very act of her submission, of her sexual subjugation, was a form of dominance. It was a way of reinforcing the Viking hierarchy, a reminder that power belonged to the strong and the brutal. The distinction between free and enslaved women in Viking society was stark. For free women, their sexuality was an asset, a source of power that could be used to assert their status and influence. But for enslaved women, their sexuality was their chains, their greatest vulnerability. They were forced to bear children for their captors, children who would be sold into slavery, or raised as part of the household. Their bodies, their sexual autonomy, were not their own. And in this world of brutality and power, these women were left to live out their lives as mere objects in a much larger game of domination and control. Yet, despite these stark differences, we also see that women in Viking society were not entirely powerless. Even enslaved women, despite the horrific violence they suffered, could sometimes assert their agency. There are stories in the sagas of enslaved women who managed to escape, to find their way back to freedom, or who influenced the lives of their captors in subtle ways. These stories, though rare, remind us that even in the most oppressive of circumstances, the human spirit is capable of resistance. As we sit quietly in reflection, we come to understand that the world of Viking women was one of complex power dynamics, where their sexuality, though often controlled and manipulated, was also a source of strength. The free Viking woman held a certain level of power in her ability to influence relationships, to bear children who would carry on the family name, and to assert her position within the household. But for the enslaved woman, power was a distant dream. Her sexuality was not hers to control, and her life was one of submission and subjugation. And so, as we pause to reflect on this, we understand that the role of women in Viking sexuality was one of duality. For the free women, their sexuality was a tool of power, of influence. But for the enslaved women, it was a source of suffering, a symbol of their subjugation. In both cases, however, sexuality was not merely a personal matter. It was a force, a weapon, and a currency. And in this world of strength and power, where the balance of life and death was ever precarious, the women of Viking society were as essential to its fabric as the men who fought to conquer and rule. As we slowly journey further into the shadows of Viking history, where the stillness of time has erased much of the truth, we come to a quiet, hidden world. A world where the very fabric of society was woven not just from strength, but from the suffering of those who had no voice, no power, and no place. This was the world of Viking slavery, a world that, though often obscured by the heroics of their warriors and the mythologies that surrounded them, was as much a part of their culture as the ships that cut through the waves, or the blood that stained their battlefields. Imagine for a moment the cold, damp air of a Viking settlement at dawn. The streets, still shrouded in mist, are quiet at first, but as the day wears on, the sounds of life begin to stir. The clink of metal, the murmur of voices, the crackle of a fire burning in the distance, these sounds would have filled the spaces between the houses and the market squares. It is in these market squares, in these places of exchange, that the true nature of Viking power is revealed. For here, human lives were traded like commodities. The Viking slave markets, found in places like Dublin and York, were thriving centers of commerce, where captives, often women and children, were sold to the highest bidder. These slaves, captured from raids across the British Isles, Europe, and even further afield, were brought to the heart of Viking settlements, where their lives were no longer their own. They were reduced to objects traded for goods for coin, or for labor. Their bodies, once free, were now the property of the Viking men who bought them. To understand the depth of this practice, we must first consider the role of slavery in Viking society. The Vikings, as skilled traders, understood the value of human labor. They relied on slaves for domestic work, agricultural labor, and even for sexual purposes. A slave's body was no longer their own. It was a tool to be used, a commodity to be exchanged. The notion of personal autonomy was stripped away, leaving behind a hollow existence where one's worth was defined solely by their utility to their captors. Now, let us consider the fate of the enslaved women, for it is in their plight that we see the most painful aspects of Viking slavery. Enslaved women were often taken in raids, captured from villages, towns, or even other cultures, and brought back to the Viking settlements, where their fate was sealed. They were forced into labor, into servitude, and often into sexual exploitation. In a society where power was everything, these women were the most powerless of all. Their bodies became the property of their captors, and their lives were bound by the chains of their subjugaon. In the slave markets, the scene was one of stark brutality. Imagine, if you will, the sound of chains clinking softly, the quiet murmur of voices as buyers and sellers haggled over the price of a life. The enslaved women would stand in rows, their faces blank, their eyes empty of hope, as they were auctioned off like cattle. Their bodies, their identities, had been erased. All that remained was their physical presence, an object to be traded, a commodity to be bought. These women, captured from distant lands, were often forced into sexual servitude. Their bodies were used to bear children for their captors, children who would grow up to serve in the same system of oppression, or, in some cases, to be sold in turn. The sexual exploitation of these women was not just a form of personal humiliation. It was a way of reinforcing the social structure, a means of showing that the Vikings held ultimate control over the lives of others. As we sit quietly in this space, we are reminded of the vast, silent undercurrent of Viking society, the human suffering that underpinned the glory of their conquests. For every Viking warrior who returned with riches and spoils from a raid, there were countless women and children whose lives were shattered, whose identities were erased by the brutal system of slavery. These people were reduced to mere tools in a much larger game, a game of power, of dominance, and of control. The impact of this system was not just felt by the women themselves, but by the entire community. Slavery in Viking society was not something that existed on the fringes. It was embedded within the very core of their culture. The Vikings, as traders and conquerors, understood that the economy of their world depended on the exploitation of others. They traded goods, they traded land, and they traded people, using the lives of the enslaved to fuel their own success and expansion. But what does this tell us about Viking society? It tells us that, for all their strength, for all their glory, the Vikings were also a society built on exploitation. The very foundation of their wealth and power was shaped by the subjugation of others, by the forced labor and sexual exploitation of those they conquered. And it is in this uncomfortable truth that we see the darker side of Viking life, a life that was sustained not just by warriors and leaders, but by the suffering of those who had no voice. It is important, as we reflect on this, to understand the complexity of Viking culture. The Vikings, like so many ancient societies, were not simply defined by their heroic battles or their expansive trade routes. They were also shaped by the systems of oppression that existed within their world, systems that allowed them to thrive at the expense of others. And in this world, the enslaved were the most vulnerable, the most exploited, and the most forgotten. Imagine, as the sun sets over the cold northern lands, the quiet passage of time that has carried these truths into the shadows. The world of the Vikings is long gone, but the legacies of their actions, both the glory and the suffering, remain hidden in the folds of history. The stories of the enslaved women, those whose lives were traded and sold, may never be fully told. But they are here, in the quiet moments, where we pause to reflect on the darker side of Viking power. And as we sit in the stillness of this reflection, we are reminded that power, in all its forms, comes with a price. For the Vikings, that price was paid by those who had no voice, by the enslaved, whose lives were exchanged for goods, for power, and for control. Their bodies were the battlegrounds on which the Vikings asserted their dominance, their superiority, and their place in the world. As we slowly drift forward in time, through the ancient corridors of Viking culture, we come to a quiet yet profound tradition, a tradition that speaks to the heart of their society, one that binds individuals together, yet leaves them exposed for all to see. The Viking wedding was unlike any other in its public nature, its ritualistic significance, and its deeply symbolic power. It was not merely a union of two people, a simple joining of hearts. No, in the Viking world, a wedding was far more than that. It was a performance, a display of power, a statement of one's place in the larger order of things. Imagine, as the first light of dawn rises over the rugged, snow-dusted landscape of the Viking homeland, the air filled with the scent of earth and the distant cry of gulls flying over the sea. The Viking village stirs to life, and in the midst of it all, preparations begin for a wedding, a ceremony that will be witnessed not in the privacy of a home, but in the public eye, where all can see, all can judge, and all can understand this true meaning of what is unfolding. In Viking society, weddings were not private affairs. They were social events, performed in front of family, friends, and sometimes even strangers. These ceremonies, full of symbolism and deeply woven with cultural significance, marked not just the union of two people, but the reinforcement of societal norms, expectations, and power structures. To be married in Viking society was to announce one's place within the community, to confirm one's role in the continuing cycles of life and death, of strength and survival. At the heart of the Viking wedding stood the bride and groom, their fates entwined not just by the vows they exchanged, but by the rituals that bound them to the gods, to the land, and to each other. The bride, draped in her finest clothes, her face hidden beneath a veil, stood before the assembled crowd, the weight of her role as a future mother, a future partner, and a future guardian of the family resting upon her shoulders. She was not simply a woman in this moment. She was a symbol, an embodiment of the fertility, strength, and continuity that Viking society so deeply revered. The groom, standing beside her, was equally bound by the weight of tradition. His role as protector, provider, and warrior firmly etched into the expectations of the Viking world. In the eyes of the community, he was not just a man marrying his love, he was a leader, a warrior, a man whose strength and masculinity would shape the future of the family. The act of marriage was not only about love or companionship. It was about power, honor, and the affirmation of one's ability to fulfill their societal duties. But what made the Viking wedding even more striking was its public nature. In a world where privacy was often reserved for the most intimate of moments, the wedding stood as a public spectacle, a display of sexual power, dominance, and the continuation of the family line. The very act of consummating the marriage was not something done behind closed doors. It was a moment to be witnessed, to be observed by the community, as if to confirm the union's legitimacy and the couple's ability to perform their duties. In this moment, we could almost feel the quiet tension that would have filled the air as the bride and groom approached the threshold of their new life together. The crowd gathered around them would have watched not only with excitement, but with judgment, as the consummation of the marriage marked the final seal of the bond. The marriage was not truly complete until this intimate act, performed in public view, was carried out. It was as if the entire community had a vested interest in the success of this union, in ensuring that the power dynamics of the household were affirmed, and that the sexual potency of the marriage was demonstrated for all to see. The symbolism of the act was clear. The public nature of the wedding was a reminder that in Viking society, power was not just personal, it was social. Every action, every choice, was done in the public eye, for the community's approval, for the gods' approval, and for the future of the family. The act of consummating the marriage, though deeply personal, was also a public performance, a demonstration of the couple's ability to continue the lineage, to produce heirs, and to affirm their place in the intricate social structure of the Viking world. In these rituals, the Vikings made it clear that marriage was not simply a romantic union. It was a means of reinforcing power, order, and continuity. The symbolic acts surrounding the wedding, such as the bride's veil and the groom's role as protector, were not just ceremonial. They were vital to the very identity of the individuals involved. The Viking marriage was a reminder that sexuality, reproduction, and power were all interconnected in a web of social expectations that bound each person to the larger community. Yet, even within the public spectacle of the wedding, there remained subtle, almost imperceptible tensions. The very act of the wedding was a reflection of the delicate balance between the private and the public, between personal desires and societal needs. The bride and groom, though central to the ceremony, were not just individual people. They were symbols standing in for larger societal forces. The wedding was not about personal love or affection. It was about securing the future of the family, of the community, and of the Viking way of life itself. In the quiet aftermath of the ceremony, as the crowd slowly began to disperse, there was a deep sense of satisfaction in the air. The union had been completed, the marriage sealed not only by the vows exchanged, but by the public performance of intimacy. The couple, now bound together by more than just love, could begin their new life, knowing that their place in the Viking world had been secured. They had fulfilled their roles, met the expectations of their community, and reaffirmed the power structures that defined their lives. As we sit quietly, reflecting on this public display of intimacy, we are reminded that the Viking world was one of complex, overlapping forces that connected the personal with the public, the private with the social. The wedding was not merely a ritual. It was a declaration of power, an assertion of place, and a reinforcement of the social order. In this world, sexuality was never just a private matter. It was a public performance, a demonstration of strength, dominance, and continuity. And in this quiet moment of reflection, we can almost hear the soft whispers of the past, as the Vikings, in their wisdom and brutality, understood that power, at its heart, was always a matter of public display. As we quietly move through the layers of Viking history, we arrive at a place where the personal and the public converge in one of the most intimate and significant moments of a Viking marriage, the wedding night. In a world where every action was scrutinized and every bond was woven into the social fabric of the community, even the act of consummating a marriage was imbued with great meaning. It was not merely a private union between two individuals. It was a public declaration of strength, of power, and of one's ability to fulfill the role that society demanded. Imagine, as the evening settles in, the air cool and still, the soft rustle of fabric as the bride prepares for the night that will seal her union. In the quiet, flickering light of the Viking hall, the couple stands ready to fulfill their vows, not just to one another, but to the gods, to their families, and to their community. The wedding night was a moment of both personal intimacy and public expectation. It was an act of consummation, but it was also an act of public performance, an act that would be witnessed, evaluated, and in some cases, judged. For the Vikings, a successful wedding night was far more than a matter of personal satisfaction. It was a matter of honor. The Viking marriage was seen as a union that was bound not just by love or desire, but by social duty. The couple's ability to consummate their marriage in front of the community was an affirmation of their strength, their fertility, and their place within the larger social order. It was an act that, when performed properly, solidified the union and ensured that the couple's role in the continuation of the family and the community was assured. But in this world of strict expectations, failure was not an option. To fail in the act of consummation was to risk more than just personal embarrassment. It was to risk legal consequences, to risk being seen as weak, as unfit for the responsibilities of marriage and family. In Viking society, where honor was the very foundation of one's identity, to fail to fulfill the wedding night ritual was a grave matter. The implications were far-reaching, affecting not only the bride and groom, but also their families and their place within the community. In these moments, we can almost hear the soft rustle of voices, the murmurs of the onlookers as they quietly await the consummation of the marriage. The community, gathered in hushed anticipation, would wait for the moment when the couple would consummate their union, marking the beginning of their life together. The act of consummation, witnessed by others, was seen as a validation of the marriage's legitimacy. It was proof, in a world that prized strength above all else, that the couple was capable of fulfilling their role in the perpetuation of the Viking lineage. But what if the consummation failed? What if the marriage was not completed as expected? In this world, where failure was a sign of weakness, the consequences could be severe. The legal ramifications of an unsuccessful wedding night were significant, as Viking society was deeply rooted in the concept of public honor. If the marriage was not consummated, or if the bride's family believed that the groom had failed in his duties, they could take legal action. The bride's family had the right to sue the groom for poor performance, seeking compensation for the perceived failure. This legal aspect of Viking marriage adds another layer of complexity to the wedding night ritual. The Viking wedding, though deeply personal and intimate, was also a public affair, one that was bound by legal expectations and social consequences. The bride's family, who had given her away in marriage, held a vested interest in the success of the union. If the marriage failed to meet the community's expectations, it was seen not just as a personal failure, but as a failure to uphold the family's honor. And in Viking society, honor was everything. The consequences of dishonor were harsh, and the public nature of the wedding night ensured that this failure would be witnessed by all. The legal consequences of a failed consummation were not limited to compensation alone. There were deeper social ramifications as well. If the marriage was not consummated, or if the bride and groom were unable to fulfill their roles, the social contract between the two families could be broken. The failure of the wedding night could lead to a breakdown in relationships, to a loss of respect within the community, and to a weakening of one's place within the social hierarchy. Imagine, as the evening stretches on, the quiet tension that would fill the room after the wedding night. The couple, now bound by the legal and social expectations of their marriage, must navigate the quiet whispers of their community, the weight of their failure or success hanging over them. For the groom, the act of consummating the marriage was not simply about personal desire. It was about proving his strength, his capability, and his worth to his new wife, his new family, and the community. And for the bride, the act was just as significant. To be able to consummate the marriage, to fulfill her role as a wife and mother, was to prove her own strength, her ability to carry on the family line, and her place within the Viking social order, not in Viking society, where everything was defined by the ability to perform one's role. Failure was not taken lightly. The wedding night was more than just a ritual. It was the gateway to one's future. The success or failure of the marriage could shape the couple's entire life together, determining their place within the community and their ability to fulfill the expectations placed upon them. The pressure of this responsibility would have been immense. The weight of societal expectations pressing down on both the bride and the groom as they navigated the complexities of their new life together. But despite the intense pressure and the harsh legal consequences of failure, there was also a sense of pride in the successful completion of the wedding night. To consummate the marriage in front of the community was to affirm one's place in Viking society, to prove that they were capable of fulfilling their role as husband and wife. It was a public declaration that the marriage was legitimate, that the family line would continue, and that the couple was worthy of the honor and respect of their community. And so, as the hours of the night pass and the community slowly disperses, the couple is left to reflect on the weight of what has just transpired. They are now bound not only by love and desire, but by the weight of legal and social expectations, the consequences of their actions stretching out before them like the vast, uncharted seas. The Viking wedding, though a celebration of love and unity, was also a reminder that in this world, everything was bound by the expectations of the community, the laws of the land, and the unwavering pursuit of honor. As we journey through the long, winding path of Viking life, we come to a quiet, sacred space, a moment when a warrior, a leader, or a beloved member of the community passes beyond the mortal realm. In Viking society, death was not merely an end, it was a transition, a passage to something greater, a journey that demanded respect and ritual. The Viking funeral, with all its deep symbolism and ancient traditions, was a powerful event, one that not only honored the dead, but also reaffirmed the values of life, strength, and sacrifice that defined Viking culture. Imagine, if you will, the stillness of the Viking world at dusk, the faint whisper of the wind through the trees, the quiet hum of nature as the time of the ritual approaches. In the distance, the sound of a funeral procession can be heard, a slow, solemn march towards the burial site, where the body of the deceased will be laid to rest. The air is thick with the weight of tradition, the scent of firewood and earth mingling as the warriors and the family gather to witness the final rites. Viking funeral was a moment of profound significance, for it was not merely about placing the body in the ground. It was about sending the soul of the deceased to the afterlife, ensuring their safe passage and guaranteeing that their strength, honor, and power would endure beyond death. To the Vikings, death was not an end, but a beginning, a continuation of the eternal struggle for power, strength, and dominance. The rituals performed in the funeral were meant to reflect these beliefs, to honor the dead, and to send them on their journey to Valhalla, or the realm of the gods, One of the most notable aspects of Viking funerals was the practice of human sacrifice. To the Vikings, sacrifice was not just an offering of material goods, it was an offering of life itself. The ritual sacrifice, often of slaves or captives, was seen as necessary to ensure that the soul of the deceased would be properly guided to the afterlife. The victim was often killed in a manner that symbolized their role in the afterlife, and their death was seen as a form of tribute to the gods. In some cases, the sacrifice involved was of a sexual nature. Enslaved women, those who had been captured in raids or had fallen into Viking hands, were sometimes chosen to accompany the dead, to serve as a symbol of the deceased's strength, masculinity, and fertility. These women, stripped of their agency, were seen as the ultimate offering, a final act of submission and sacrifice that would ensure the deceased's power would be sustained in the afterlife. They were, in the eyes of Viking society, the final link between the living and the dead, and their sacrifice was a solemn, if deeply disturbing, part of the funeral rites that imagine the quiet intensity of these moments, where the victim chosen to accompany the dead would be led to the site of the ritual. The air, heavy with expectation, would be thick with the weight of what was to come. The community, gathered in the shadows, would witness the final act of sacrifice, the offering of life to ensure the deceased's safe passage to the afterlife. The woman, chosen for her role, would face her fate, knowing that her body was no longer her own. She was, in the eyes of the Vikings, an offering a necessary sacrifice to ensure that the power of the deceased would endure. This ritual, though disturbing to modern sensibilities, was a deeply ingrained part of Viking culture. For the Vikings, death was a continuation of life, a journey that required strength, honor, and sacrifice. The rituals surrounding the funeral were meant to reflect these values, to send the deceased off with the proper respect and ensure their place in the afterlife. The sexual nature of the sacrifice was seen as a way to demonstrate the power and potency of the deceased, to ensure that their legacy would live on through the rituals performed in their honor. The victims of these sacrifices, often enslaved women, were not seen as individuals with their own rights and identities. They were viewed as objects, as commodities to be used in the service of the gods and the deceased. Their lives, once captured in raids or traded for goods, were now nothing more than tools in the ritual of death. They were offered up to ensure that the power and strength of the deceased would persist, that their masculinity would be reinforced in the afterlife, and that their legacy would endure for generations to come. But as we reflect on these practices, we are reminded of the darker sides of Viking culture, of the ways in which power and domination were deeply intertwined with sexuality, and of the lengths to which the Vikings went to ensure their place in the eternal struggle for power. The sexual sacrifice, though viewed by the Vikings as a necessary and sacred act, was ultimately an act of violence, one that stripped the victim of her identity, her agency, and her dignity. It was a brutal reminder of the way in which Viking society placed immense value on power, strength, and control, even in the realm of death. That in the quiet aftermath of these rituals, we can almost hear the soft murmur of the crowd, the voices that would echo through the halls of Viking homes and temples as they reflected on the events of the day. The sacrifice, though completed, would leave a lasting mark, not just on the victim, but on the entire community. The act of human sacrifice was not only about sending the deceased to the afterlife. It was also about reinforcing the power structures of the living. It was a reminder that in Viking society, strength and dominance were paramount, and that the body, whether living or dead, was a symbol of that power. As we sit quietly, reflecting on these ancient practices, we understand that the Viking funeral was more than just a ritual of death. It was a ritual of power. It was a statement about the importance of strength, honor, and sacrifice in the Viking world. The human sacrifices, though deeply unsettling, were a way of ensuring that the deceased would carry their power into the afterlife, and that their legacy would live on through those who survived them. And so, as we quietly sit in this space of reflection, we are reminded that the Viking world, with all its glory and power, was also a world of brutality, where the line between life and death was often blurred, and where the strongest ruled, even in the afterlife. The sacrifices, the rituals, and the funerals were all part of a larger narrative, one in which power, control, and legacy were bound together in the most intimate and disturbing ways. As we come to the end of our journey through the Viking world, we pause for a moment of quiet reflection. The ancient halls, the distant ships, and the ever-present winds that swept across the northern lands seem to fade into the horizon, as the legacy of the Vikings lingers in the quiet spaces between the past and the present. What was once a vibrant, powerful culture full of triumphs, brutality, and belief in dominance has left its mark on the world in ways both seen and unseen. From their exploration of distant lands to their influence on modern politics and culture, the Vikings remain a powerful symbol of strength, honor, and the complexities of power. Yet, it is not just their wars or their voyages that have left an imprint upon history. The Viking approach to sexuality, masculinity, and power has resonated through the centuries, continuing to shape the social dynamics of medieval Europe and influencing modern understandings of dominance, control, and gender. In the quiet, reflective moments of our journey, we see how the Vikings' practices, especially those centered around sexual control and power, have left a long-lasting legacy, one that transcends time and place. Let us consider, for a moment, the way Viking society viewed sexuality. In this world of warriors and gods, sex was not a private matter. It was a tool, a weapon, and a means of asserting one's place within the social order. To control one's sexuality was to control one's destiny. For men, sexual dominance and the ability to assert power through their sexual identity were integral to their social standing. To be seen as sexually capable, to be able to perform and dominate in this realm, was a reflection of a man's strength, his ability to lead, and his worth as a Viking. But it was not only the men who held this power. Viking women, despite the constraints placed upon them by a patriarchal society, also wielded a quiet power through their control over sexuality. A woman's ability to insult or humiliate her husband sexually could destroy his reputation, his standing, and his honor. She could manipulate and shape her husband's public identity, shaping the power dynamics of the household, and, at times, influencing the course of Viking society itself. This intricate relationship between sexuality, power, and gender played a significant role in shaping the structure of Viking society. It was a society where personal relationships were never solely about love or affection. They were about dominance, respect, and maintaining one's position within the larger web of social order. Marriage, sex, and reproduction were not just private affairs, but public performances of power, constantly measured by societal norms, expectations, and laws. As we reflect on the legacy of Viking sexuality, we see that the concepts of masculinity, dominance, and control that were so integral to their worldview continued to shape the politics and culture of medieval Europe. The idea that power, whether political, social, or sexual, was the ultimate currency influenced the feudal systems that emerged in the wake of Viking raids. Just as Viking leaders asserted their power through physical dominance, so too did the medieval rulers of Europe. In many ways, the legacy of Viking masculinity can still be seen today. The notion of the Viking warrior, strong, fearless, and in control, has been romanticized in modern culture, influencing how masculinity is viewed in contemporary society. The Viking ideal of sexual dominance and the conflation of masculinity with strength and power continues to resonate in modern understandings of gender roles. particularly in how men are expected to embody control, strength, and sexual prowess. The Vikings' influence on modern masculinity is subtle but pervasive, shaping the expectations of men in ways that continue to echo through modern media, literature, and social norms. But the Vikings' impact on modern gender politics is not limited to masculinity alone. Their treatment of women, particularly in terms of sexual control and subjugation, has also left an indelible mark on the power dynamics of Western society. The sexual violence, human trafficking, and sexual sacrifices that were ingrained in Viking culture laid the foundation for the patriarchal structures that would later dominate European society. Women were objectified, controlled, and often reduced to mere tools in the larger systems of power. While the Vikings were not the sole creators of these systems, their practices contributed to the establishment of gendered power dynamics that would persist for centuries. As we sit quietly, reflecting on the Viking legacy, we see how their practices, both violent and intimate, have shaped the broader cultural landscape. The Vikings' ability to assert power through sexuality, their strict delineation of gender roles, and their manipulation of honor and reputation through sexual control were not just societal norms, they were foundational to the creation of systems of power and dominance that have persisted into modern times. Their legacy is one of strength, but also one of brutality, one that reminds us of the ways in which power can be wielded, not only through physical force, but through the manipulation of the most intimate aspects of life. In the quiet moments of reflection, we come to understand that the Viking legacy is not just about the conquests they achieved or the lands they explored. It is also about the way they shaped our understanding of power, how it is asserted, how it is maintained, and how it can be used to control and dominate others. From their violent battles to their deeply ingrained systems of sexual power, the Vikings created a world where control over others was paramount, and the legacy of that control continues to echo through time. As we slowly step back from this quiet reflection, we realize that the Viking world, so distant in time, still speaks to us today. Its ideals of masculinity, power, and dominance continue to shape our understanding of gender and strength, reminding us that the past, though long gone, never truly fades away. It lives on in the quiet spaces of our modern lives, in the expectations we place upon ourselves and others, and in the way we continue to navigate the complex landscape of power, sexuality, and identity. As the last whispers of Viking history fade into the distance, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of a quiet realization, a realization that the Viking world, with all its glory, brutality, and complex power dynamics, was one of deep human nature. It was a world where strength, honor, and power were not simply ideals, they were the very essence of life itself. But as we have seen, the Vikings, for all their strength and boldness, were also a people who understood the fragility of life, the tenuousness of honor, and the profound impact that power could have, not just on the body, but on the soul. In the flickering shadows of Viking halls, where the firelight would dance across the walls, and the echoes of battle still whispered in the wind, the practices of sexual dominance, sexual violence, and sexual power were woven into the very fabric of their society. They used these acts not merely to assert control over bodies, but to establish and reinforce the social order, to ensure their place in a world that demanded strength at every turn. Through these acts, they solidified their identities, ensured the survival of their people, and left a legacy that continues to ripple through the world today. And yet, as we reflect upon the darker corners of Viking culture, we are reminded that history, in all its complexity, is not merely a series of conquests and triumphs. It is also a tapestry of suffering, of subjugation, and of the ways in which power can be used to control, manipulate, and define. The Vikings, with all their brilliance and brutality, did not just shape the world of their time, They also shaped the world we live in today, leaving behind a legacy that echoes in the way we understand masculinity, power, and gender. As the embers of their fire burn low and the winds of time carry their stories farther away, we can still hear the faint echoes of Viking life, not just in the wars they fought, the ships they sailed, or the gods they worshipped, but in the subtle, often painful, ways their practices continue to influence how we live today. Their legacy, like the Viking ships that once sailed across distant seas, continues to move through the waters of history, shaping the way we understand power, control, and identity. And so, as we bring our journey to a close, let us pause for a moment in quiet reflection. Let us remember the Vikings, not only for their strength and glory, but for the lessons they impart about the complexity of power, how it can uplift, destroy, and forever alter the course of history. Their world may be long gone, but their legacy remains, woven into the very fabric of human existence.